I want to start here with the just recent past elections in Nicaragua, won by the FSLN, the Sandinista Party. And we are very happy to be joined for this conversation by Ben Norton, who's a journalist and assistant editor at the Grayzone, who was there and is there in Nicaragua. Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on this great program.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, Ben, I guess maybe my first question for you is there is quite a bit of hue and cry in the press in the United States against the Sandinistas, demonizing their leadership, but it seems like they won a landslide victory there in Nicaragua. What does that say about the difference between the rhetoric and the reality as it concerns the current situation in Nicaragua?
Well, there are so many lies. Frankly, there's just so much fake news, blatant fake news in mainstream corporate media outlets trying to discredit the revolution in Nicaragua and the elections on November 7th. Here you can see the video of people celebrating spontaneously. These are Sandinista supporters. They came out the night of the election, so around like midnight on the night of the 7th, the early morning of the 8th, to celebrate into the very early hours of the morning. And there's so much fake news trying to discredit these Nicaraguans, acting as though they don't exist, acting as though the Sandinista Front is not the vibrant force that it is, acting as though it doesn't have the support of the majority of Nicaraguans. Polls have consistently shown for many months leading up to the election that the Sandinistas have the support of around two-thirds of Nicaraguans. And that's not surprising because the Sandinistas, since they came back to 2007, they they have created a system of free universal healthcare, which is high quality in a very poor country with few resources, free higher education for everyone, great infrastructure programs, jobs programs, public housing, and very cheap housing for people, good quality housing that costs very little. So it's no surprise that the Sandinistas won re-election, but there's been a concerted attempt in foreign corporate media outlets to act as though the elections were supposedly rigged, which is false, that turnout was supposedly low, which is also false, that the opposition was barred from participating, another blatant lie. In fact, at the Grayzone, I just published an article going through systematically each of the lies spread by the New York Times and other outlets, but specifically the New York Times, whose reporter was not in Nicaragua with
Mm.
us, the other reporters. She was in Mexico. So from Mexico, apparently they think that they have like some it's like telepathic power where they can just figure out what's going on across these multiple borders in Nicaragua, but they weren't actually on the ground. I was on the ground. I went to four different electoral sites, four different centers. I interviewed voters and I published video of the voters. And frankly, the campaign, the dirty campaign against Nicaragua is nothing more than fake news. I mean, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but that's exactly what it is. It's completely fake. And being here and seeing the flagrant lies in foreign media outlets, it makes you kind of feel crazy almost because
Mm.
what you're seeing on the ground is directly contradicted, but by all of the major media outlets from the New York Times to the Washington Post and beyond.
What do you think is motivating this just unreality in terms of what's going on in Nicaragua? I mean, you listed a number of things that sound, I think most people would think that sounds good, affordable housing, healthcare, all these other pieces. What's behind the demonization, you think?
Well, the narrative used to attack the Sandinista government is that President Daniel Ortega is now entering his fourth term. Remember, this was the same propaganda used against Evo Morales in Bolivia, which was used to carry out a military coup, a far right military coup in November of 2019, exactly 2 years ago. 2 years ago this week, when Evo Morales won his fourth term of re election, and there was this campaign saying that Evo Morales in Bolivia was supposedly authoritarian. Supposedly he was a dictator, when in reality, he won the election with over half of the vote. That's exactly what's happening here in Nicaragua. Yes, Ortega is entering his fourth term, but that's because he's an extremely popular figure. And in some ways, term limits can be undemocratic if a leader is very popular, as we see right now in Brazil, rather. In Brazil, Lula da Silva is trying to go for his third term, and a lot of Brazilians would rather have Lula da Silva rather than the far right corrupt candidate, current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who only came to power because Lula da Silva was imprisoned. What we're seeing here is an attempt to meddle blatantly in the internal electoral process of Nicaragua because the US government will not tolerate the Sandinistas in power. That's why in 2018, Washington backed a brutally violent coup attempt here in Nicaragua. I've interviewed loved ones, family members, friends of people, of Sandinistas who were killed, who were tortured by these far right coup plotters. And what's interesting is that the 2019 coup in Bolivia, it's well known. It got a lot of attention, rightfully, in the global North left, in the international media, because it was so flagrant. It was so clearly racist and violent. The thing is, the blueprint for the 2019 coup in Bolivia that succeeded, what was used a year before here in Nicaragua, but it failed. It failed because the Sandinistas were so popular. It failed because, unlike in Bolivia, where Evo Morales didn't control the military, here the military is a nationalist, pro-Sandinista military. But the point is that the same violent terrorist tactics used against indigenous people in Bolivia, supporters of the MAS party, the same tactics were used here to terrorize Sandinistas. And people in Nicaragua, they're not dumb. They remember what happened just 3 years ago. They remember the violence sponsored by Washington and Brussels. And that's one of the main reasons the Sandinistas won with such a large margin. They won with 76% of the vote and 65% turnout. The second place right-wing party, the PLC, the Liberal Constitutionalist Party, got 14% of the vote because people are tired of the neoliberal corrupt status quo and they want to continue. And yes, Ortega's in his fourth term, but that doesn't mean he's a dictator. It means he's a very popular leader and people want him back in power again because he's the only leader who has created a system of universal health care, who has created a system of universal education, jobs, housing, and safety in a very dangerous region where El Salvador and Honduras, the neighbors of Nicaragua, have some of the highest murder rates in the world, have gangs, have narco trafficking is a huge problem. Here in Nicaragua, none of those problems exist. And that's why the Sandinistas are so popular. And that's why people keep voting for them. And the right-wing opposition can't win an election. So they tried a violent coup in 2018. It failed. So their only other option left is to try to discredit the elections by saying that they're rigged, which is false, by saying the opposition didn't participate. That's false. There were 5 opposition parties on the ballot alongside Ortega from the Sandinista Front. So the only option they have left is to try to discredit the electoral process, exactly what they tried to do in Venezuela, because they're violent coups attempt and they can't win an election freely and fairly.
Yeah, and we should add that, this comes on the heels of a new sanctions package that the US just passed against Nicaragua that's quite harsh and restrictive. And I will just say, like, Anthony Blinken tweeted this out a couple hours ago. He congratulated the president for signing the RENACER Act, which is the new sanctions against Nicaragua, and said this bill provides the State Department with additional tools to support democracy in Nicaragua. So, I mean, just to add to what you said, what you just said, it's unfortunate because this is definitely going to have a very impact on a country that's already impoverished, such as Nicaragua, to have these kinds of siege-like tactics that we've seen against Cuba and Venezuela.
Yeah, well, it's not a coincidence that Nicaragua was the next country on the list to be targeted by a U.S. economic blockade. Let's not forget that in the Trump administration, it was National Security Advisor John Bolton, a hardcore neoconservative architect of the Iraq War. He infamously declared that Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba were part of the so-called troika of tyranny. Well, the U.S. has already had an illegal criminal blockade against Cuba since the early 1960s. And every year at the United Nations, the entire world, excluding the US and Israel, condemn that illegal blockade. And the US now has a blockade against Venezuela and suffocating sanctions against Venezuela. So it was unfortunately only a matter of time until Nicaragua was next to be targeted for being a member of the Troika of Resistance against US meddling in the region, the Troika of Resistance in defense of socialized systems of universal health care and medicine and housing programs and all of these programs that you can see in the images here. These are Sandinista youth. Most of them are from humble backgrounds, poor and working class families, and they're volunteers and they're activists in the Sandinista Front because their lives have been so greatly improved by the Sandinistas. It's exactly the same thing in Venezuela. It's the same thing in Cuba. And people are willing to fight to defend that revolution. So now the U.S. is going to try the tactic it always uses, which is an economic blockade, economic warfare. It's going to try to make the economy scream, as Richard Nixon famously said about the Allende socialist government in Chile. It's the same tactic today. And we've seen in Cuba that it doesn't work in removing the popular government, but it does work in making the people suffer. And that's what unfortunately is going to happen in the next few years. I'll be here reporting. And the very likely outcome is that the Sandinistas are going to continue to gain support as the country is more and more aggressively attacked by Washington and Brussels, and people are going to be squeezed. The economy is really going to hurt, but the Sandinistas have really governed effectively. They also have created a system of food sovereignty, which is extremely important. This is a largely agricultural country, and in the neoliberal era with the US-backed right-wing governments, they imported a lot of food. Well, the Sandinistas, when they came back in 2007, they remembered the experience of the US blockade against Nicaragua in the 80s. They remembered the experience of the terror war that the CIA waged by backing the Contra death squads. They remembered that time, and they learned that one of the most important things that they had to do was increase food production. So now the Sandinistas have attained food sovereignty. Over 95% of the food consumed in Nicaragua is produced here in Nicaragua. So unfortunately, an economic blockade is coming very soon, but the Sandinistas are prepared. They have learned from their experience in the 80s. They have learned from Cuba, and they have learned from Venezuela in the past few years. The Sandinistas are not going to be defeated, but the U.S. is going to just try to make the Nicaraguan people suffer as punishment for continuing to vote for the Sandinistas.
Well, Ben, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I hope everyone checks out your piece and continues to follow your reporting on the ground in Nicaragua on all these important issues as we move forward. But thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me, and keep up all the great work.
Right on. Thank you.